The moment Ilhan Omar stated on live television that President Donald Trump did not belong in the White House, she unknowingly entered a confrontation that would unfold very differently from what many observers had expected. It was not simply a political disagreement or a sharp exchange of opposing views, but the beginning of a public clash shaped by years of accumulated grievances, media dynamics, and deeply contrasting political instincts. What followed was not driven by improvisation, but by preparation, timing, and an acute understanding of televised confrontation. Omar's remark, delivered with confidence and moral certainty, reflected a pattern familiar in modern political discourse, where symbolic language and moral framing often take precedence over procedural argument. Yet, in this case, the target of her criticism was a figure who had spent decades navigating adversarial environments, from corporate negotiations to relentless media scrutiny. Trump did not respond as a conventional politician might. Instead, he treated the challenge as an opportunity to redefine the terms of the conversation entirely. CNN had organized the event as a town hall-style conversation, branding it as an essential national dialogue about leadership, immigration, and American values. The network invested significant resources into framing the event as a moment of accountability. Producers selected a carefully balanced audience, ensuring representation from progressive activists, Trump supporters, and undecided voters. The physical setup of the studio itself was designed to encourage confrontation, with opposing chairs angled toward one another and large screens ready to display supporting visuals. Behind the scenes, CNN's editorial team anticipated a familiar narrative arc. Trump would be questioned aggressively on policy, Omar would challenge him on issues of race and inclusion, and fact-checkers would stand ready to contextualize or counter his claims. The expectation was that Trump would be placed on the defensive, producing moments of discomfort that could be replayed across news cycles. What the network underestimated was Trump's willingness to abandon the expected script entirely. Trump arrived at the studio with a clear intention to control the narrative rather than respond to it. Instead of relying solely on rhetoric, he brought extensive documentation, organized meticulously in a large binder filled with tabbed sections. Each section corresponded to a different area of controversy, including public statements, social media posts, campaign finance records, and personal timelines that had been previously discussed in journalistic investigations. This was not material gathered hastily, but information compiled over years of political conflict. The contrast backstage was striking. In Omar's preparation room, aides coordinated messaging strategies, legal advisors reviewed boundaries, and communications specialists rehearsed responses to anticipated lines of attack. The atmosphere was tense, but confident, grounded in the belief that the institutional setting and media framing would provide a protective buffer. Omar herself reviewed note cards, appearing assured that familiar defenses would suffice. Trump's preparation space, by contrast, was notably quiet. There were no visible teams huddled in urgent discussion, no last-minute coaching sessions. Instead, Trump reviewed his materials calmly, occasionally flipping through pages and adjusting tabs. Observers noted his demeanor appeared more akin to a business executive preparing for a high-stakes negotiation than a politician bracing for a hostile interview. When the event began, the audience responded exactly as CNN had hoped. Omar entered first, receiving strong applause from her supporters and polite acknowledgement from others. She presented herself with composure, wearing attire that projected confidence and authority. Moments later, Trump entered to sustained applause that surprised even seasoned production staff. The reaction underscored his enduring ability to energize a live audience, a skill honed through decades in public life. Moderator Jake Tapper opened the proceedings with a structured explanation of the format, emphasizing civility and respectful dialogue. Yet the tone shifted almost immediately. Before the first policy question could fully unfold, Omar seized the moment to address Trump directly, delivering a sharp critique that framed him as unfit for office and emblematic of division and intolerance. Her words were forceful, and the audience reacted audibly, sensing the significance of the moment. Trump's response did not mirror the intensity of the accusation. Instead, he smiled, acknowledged her presence, and briefly complimented her appearance, an unexpected move that diffused immediate tension and drew laughter from the crowd. This seemingly light response served a strategic purpose, allowing him to reset the emotional tone before redirecting the conversation. Rather than countering her accusation directly, Trump reframed the discussion around the concept of belonging and responsibility. He suggested that the question of who belongs where was worth examining carefully, signaling a shift away from abstract moral judgments towards specific historical context. With a nod to the production team, he introduced video footage that would shape the remainder of the exchange. The footage displayed Omar speaking at a public event in 2019, referencing the aftermath of September 11. The clip was presented without commentary, allowing viewers to hear her words in full. The studio grew quiet as the video played, and the weight of the moment became apparent. Trump allowed the silence to linger before speaking again, emphasizing the significance of the event and recounting his personal experience in New York City on that day. By grounding his response in personal memory rather than political rhetoric, Trump shifted the conversation into emotionally resonant territory. He described witnessing the attacks, the aftermath, and the collective trauma experienced by the city. This narrative reframing placed Omar's earlier remarks under a different light, inviting viewers to interpret them through the lens of shared national memory rather than partisan debate. The exchange marked a turning point. The audience response suggested that many viewers, regardless of political affiliation, were grappling with the implications of the footage. Tapper attempted to interject, seeking to restore balance and move the discussion forward. But Trump continued, emphasizing that public officials bear responsibility for how they reference moments of national tragedy. From there, Trump expanded the discussion to include Omar's past statements on foreign policy and political influence, again relying on publicly available material rather than speculative claims. He referenced tweets and comments that had previously sparked controversy, noting that criticism had come not only from political opponents, but also from members of her own party. By doing so, he positioned his critique as an issue of consistency and accountability, rather than ideological opposition. As the debate continued, the focus drifted further from its original policy-oriented intent. Trump introduced timelines and documentation related to Omar's personal and campaign history, presenting them as unresolved questions rather than definitive conclusions. Each point was framed cautiously, often accompanied by language emphasizing investigation and inquiry rather than accusation. This approach allowed him to maintain a posture of scrutiny without overtly asserting guilt. The moderator's attempts to redirect the conversation highlighted the challenge of managing live political events once the narrative escapes its intended boundaries. The exchange had evolved into a broader discussion about identity, loyalty, and the responsibilities of public office. Audience reactions varied widely, ranging from applause to visible discomfort, reflecting the polarized nature of the moment. As the first segment of the event drew toward its midpoint, it was clear that the town hall had transformed into something far different from what CNN had planned. Rather than a structured policy debate, it had become a demonstration of how preparation, documentation, and narrative framing can reshape live political discourse. Both participants remained composed, but the balance of momentum had visibly shifted. This initial phase set the stage for what would follow, establishing the themes and dynamics that would dominate the remainder of the evening. The questions raised were no longer limited to immigration or legislative priorities, but extended into broader considerations of rhetoric, accountability, and national identity. The audience, both in the studio and watching remotely, was left to interpret not only the facts presented, but the manner in which they were deployed. As the discussion moved forward, the atmosphere inside the studio became increasingly tense, though outwardly controlled. Trump remained composed, leaning back at times, then forward when emphasizing a point, clearly aware of how body language translated through the camera. Omar, while maintaining her posture, showed subtle signs of strain as the focus remained fixed on her past remarks rather than shifting to policy proposals. The event had become less about debating ideas and more about interpreting records and responsibility. Trump continued by contextualizing the earlier video clip within a broader pattern of public commentary. He avoided overt accusations, instead framing his remarks as questions that, in his view, had never been fully addressed. By doing so, he positioned himself not as an aggressor, but as someone demanding clarity on issues that had lingered unresolved in the public domain. This rhetorical strategy allowed him to advance his critique while maintaining plausible deniability regarding intent. The audience response reflected the complexity of the moment. Some viewers nodded in agreement, others shifted uneasily in their seats. The emotional weight of the subject matter, particularly references to national trauma and collective memory, made it difficult for the conversation to remain abstract. Each reference carried symbolic significance far beyond the immediate exchange between two individuals. Omar attempted to redirect the discussion toward broader themes of discrimination and systemic bias, emphasizing her lived experience and the importance of inclusive representation. Her remarks followed a familiar structure, framing criticism as evidence of prejudice and misunderstanding. Under different circumstances, this approach had often proven effective, resonating with audiences attuned to issues of social justice and equity. Trump, however, did not engage with the argument on those terms. Instead, he acknowledged the importance of pluralism while insisting that public officials must also be held accountable for their words and actions. He reiterated that criticism of policies was legitimate, but argued that minimizing or reframing acts of violence crossed a line that demanded scrutiny. This distinction became central to his broader narrative. The moderator again attempted to steer the discussion toward immigration policy, referencing prepared questions about border enforcement and asylum procedures. Trump briefly acknowledged the topic, but quickly connected it back to the ongoing theme of accountability. He suggested that discussions about immigration policy were inseparable from questions of fairness, legality, and personal example. In doing so, he tied policy arguments back to individual conduct. As the exchange continued, Trump introduced additional publicly documented statements made by Omar in prior interviews. Each clip or quote was presented with minimal commentary, allowing the audience to form its own interpretation. This approach reinforced the sense that the discussion was evidence-driven rather than purely rhetorical, even as emotions continued to run high. Omar responded by emphasizing context, arguing that isolated excerpts failed to capture the full meaning of her remarks. She stressed that her critiques were aimed at institutions and policies, not at individuals or communities. Her tone remained measured, but the cumulative effect of repeated challenges made it increasingly difficult to reset the conversation. The tension between context and interpretation became a defining feature of the debate. Trump argued that public figures must be aware of how their words are perceived, particularly when addressing sensitive subjects. Omar countered that selective interpretation often served political agendas rather than genuine understanding. Neither position was fully reconciled, leaving viewers to navigate the ambiguity themselves. As the midpoint of the event approached, it was evident that the original framework of the town hall had dissolved. The carefully prepared policy questions had given way to a free-flowing confrontation shaped by momentum rather than moderation. The live audience, sensing the significance of the moment, reacted more openly. With applause and murmurs punctuating the exchange, Trump then transitioned to discussing campaign practices and ethical standards, referencing publicly available records related to campaign expenditures. He framed these references as examples of why transparency mattered in public life. Again, he avoided categorical statements, instead emphasizing the importance of public trust and the appearance of propriety. Omar responded by noting that the issues cited had been reviewed by relevant authorities and addressed according to established procedures. She emphasized that compliance with regulations did not equate to wrongdoing, and cautioned against conflating administrative errors with ethical failures. Her response aimed to reassure viewers that institutional safeguards were functioning as intended. Trump acknowledged her point, but argued that public perception often extends beyond technical compliance. He suggested that elected officials must consider not only what is legally permissible, but what maintains confidence among constituents. This distinction between legality and perception became another recurring theme in his remarks. Throughout this segment, the moderator struggled to balance the competing demands of fairness and control. Each attempt to interject risked appearing partisan or ineffective. The live nature of the broadcast left little room for recalibration, and the conversation continued to evolve organically, driven by the participants rather than the format. The audience's engagement remained intense. Some viewers appeared energized by the detailed examination of records, while others expressed concern that the discussion had veered too far into personal territory. The divide reflected broader tensions within the national political climate, where debates about accountability often intersect with questions of identity and representation. As the segment concluded, it was clear that the exchange had set a powerful precedent for the remainder of the evening. The themes introduced memory, accountability, context, and public trust would continue to shape the dialogue. What had begun as a policy-focused town hall had transformed into a case study in modern political confrontation, illustrating how quickly control can shift when preparation meets provocation. As the exchange entered its later stages, the dynamic between the two figures had clearly shifted from confrontation to endurance. The discussion was no longer about scoring immediate points, but about sustaining narrative control over an extended period of scrutiny. Trump appeared increasingly comfortable in this environment, treating the event less like a debate and more like a prolonged examination of record and consistency. Omar, while composed, now faced the challenge of responding to a steady stream of references that drew from years of public material. Trump transitioned toward a broader discussion of political accountability, emphasizing that public service invites examination not only of policy positions, but of personal judgment over time. He framed this not as a personal critique, but as a structural reality of democratic systems, where transparency functions as a prerequisite for trust. This framing allowed him to continue pressing his points while maintaining a tone that suggested procedural concern rather than personal animus. The conversation increasingly reflected two contrasting philosophies of political legitimacy. Omar spoke from a perspective that emphasized lived experience, systemic critique, and the importance of challenging entrenched power structures. Trump, by contrast, emphasized continuity, institutional loyalty, and symbolic unity, arguing that criticism should be balanced by visible affirmation of national cohesion. These perspectives, while not inherently incompatible, clashed sharply in the context of live television. Audience reactions became more unpredictable as the discussion deepened. Moments of applause alternated with silence, reflecting the internal calculations viewers were making as they weighed competing narratives. For some, Trump's methodical referencing of past statements suggested thoroughness and resolve. For others, the persistence of the focus felt excessive, diverting attention from substantive policy issues they had hoped to hear discussed. The moderator attempted to reintroduce questions related to foreign policy and national security, hoping to broaden the scope of the conversation. Trump accepted the shift in topic but quickly linked it back to the themes already established. He argued that foreign policy positions must be evaluated not only by their stated goals, but by the language used to describe allies, adversaries, and acts of violence. In his view, rhetoric shaped perception, and perception influenced policy outcomes. Omar responded by emphasizing the importance of critical analysis in foreign policy, particularly when addressing long-standing conflicts. She argued that questioning dominant narratives was essential to understanding global power dynamics and preventing future harm. Her comments reflected an academic approach, one that prioritized structural critique over symbolic affirmation. Trump countered by asserting that moral clarity remained essential in matters of national security. He suggested that excessive abstraction risked distancing policymakers from the human consequences of violence. By returning repeatedly to specific historical events, he reinforced his argument that clarity and empathy must accompany analysis. As the exchange unfolded, it became apparent that both participants were speaking to audiences beyond the studio. Omar's remarks resonated with viewers who valued critical discourse and social justice framing. Trump's approach appealed to those who prioritized national solidarity and perceived respect for shared history. The debate thus functioned as a microcosm of broader ideological divisions within the electorate. The visual elements of the broadcast played a significant role in shaping perception. Each time supporting material appeared on screen, it anchored the discussion in tangible reference points. This reliance on visuals reinforced Trump's emphasis on documentation and record, while simultaneously limiting Omar's ability to reframe the discussion purely through interpretation. Omar continued to stress the importance of context, noting that political language often becomes distorted when removed from its original setting. She argued that selective emphasis risked obscuring the intent behind her statements. While her explanation was measured, the cumulative effect of repeated challenges made it difficult to fully reset the narrative. Trump acknowledged the role of context, but insisted that public officials must anticipate how their words will be received by diverse audiences. He framed this expectation as a responsibility inherent to leadership, particularly in a nation shaped by shared trauma and collective memory. This emphasis reinforced his broader theme that leadership requires not only intention, but perception management. As the debate progressed, the emotional intensity remained high, but neither participant raised their voice significantly. Instead, the tension manifested through pacing, pauses, and strategic silence. These moments of quiet proved as impactful as spoken words, allowing viewers time to process the implications of what had been presented. The moderator's role became increasingly constrained as the conversation moved beyond prepared questions. Each attempt to intervene risked disrupting the flow or appearing to favor one side. In this environment, the broadcast evolved organically, driven by the participants' willingness to pursue their respective narratives to their logical conclusions. The audience, both in the studio and watching remotely, appeared acutely aware that they were witnessing a moment that would be widely discussed beyond the confines of the event. Social media engagement surged in real time, with clips circulating almost immediately as viewers shared their interpretations and reactions. The debate was no longer confined to the studio. It had entered the broader digital ecosystem. As this phase of the discussion drew to a close, the central themes had been firmly established: accountability versus context, unity versus critique, symbolism versus analysis. Each tension remained unresolved, leaving viewers to draw their own conclusions. The town hall had become less about answers and more about framing, illustrating how modern political discourse often unfolds not through resolution, but through contrast. As the event moved further into its final stretch, the cumulative weight of the discussion began to shape how each statement was received. What might have seemed like a minor clarification earlier in the evening now carried amplified significance, filtered through the layers of argument already presented. The audience's attention, sharpened by the sustained intensity, focused not only on what was said, but on what was left unsaid. Trump shifted his emphasis toward the concept of consistency over time. He argued that voters often struggle to evaluate policy platforms because they change in response to political pressure, whereas past statements and long-standing patterns of speech offered a more stable basis for judgment. This argument aligned with his broader assertion that public trust depended on predictability and perceived sincerity, qualities he suggested were undermined by ambiguous or evolving rhetoric. Omar responded by challenging the premise that consistency should be valued above growth. She argued that evolving language and perspectives reflected learning and adaptation, particularly in response to new information or shifting social norms. From her perspective, the expectation of rigid consistency risked penalizing reflection and reinforcing outdated frameworks. Her response reframed change not as instability, but as responsibility. The contrast between these viewpoints highlighted a deeper philosophical divide. Trump's position emphasized continuity as reassurance, suggesting that stability provided citizens with a sense of security in uncertain times. Omar's position emphasized responsiveness, arguing that adaptability allowed institutions and individuals to better serve diverse populations. Neither position was presented as absolute, but their tension underscored the difficulty of reconciling tradition with transformation. The moderator attempted to bridge this divide by posing a question about bipartisan cooperation. The inquiry aimed to shift the tone toward potential common ground, asking both participants how they envisioned collaboration across ideological lines. For a brief moment, the atmosphere softened. As the discussion moved away from direct confrontation, Trump responded by acknowledging the importance of cooperation, but he framed it as conditional on shared foundational values. He argued that compromise was meaningful only when participants agreed on basic principles, such as respect for national institutions and acknowledgement of historical realities. Without these shared points of reference, he suggested, cooperation risked becoming superficial. Omar echoed the importance of cooperation, but emphasized that shared values must include a willingness to question and reform institutions that had failed segments of the population. She argued that genuine bipartisanship required not only agreement on symbols, but commitment to addressing structural inequities. Her response suggested that unity should be aspirational rather than assumed. As the exchange continued, it became clear that even moments of apparent agreement carried underlying divergence. Each participant used similar language: trust, responsibility, unity, but infused these terms with distinct meanings. This semantic overlap masked substantive differences, making the conversation both accessible and elusive for viewers attempting to reconcile the positions presented. The role of narrative framing grew increasingly prominent. Trump consistently returned to specific examples and documented statements, reinforcing a linear narrative anchored in record and repetition. Omar relied more heavily on thematic explanation, situating individual remarks within broader social and historical contexts. These contrasting approaches reflected different assumptions about how audiences process information. Audience members appeared divided not only by ideology, but by communication preference. Some responded more strongly to concrete examples and visual evidence, while others were drawn to systemic analysis and conceptual framing. The event thus highlighted the challenge faced by public figures in addressing a heterogeneous audience with divergent expectations. As the discussion approached its later stages, fatigue began to subtly influence pacing. Pauses lengthened, responses became more deliberate, and the moderator's interventions grew more frequent in an effort to maintain structure. Despite this, the core tension remained intact, sustained by the unresolved nature of the themes under examination. Trump introduced a closing reflection on leadership during periods of national uncertainty. He emphasized that moments of crisis amplified the impact of language, making precision and restraint essential. His remarks suggested that leaders bore responsibility not only for decisions, but for the emotional climate shaped by their words. Omar responded with a reflection of her own, emphasizing that crises also exposed long-standing inequalities and demanded honest confrontation. She argued that discomfort was sometimes a necessary precursor to progress, and that avoiding difficult conversations risked perpetuating harm. Her response positioned candor as a form of accountability. The juxtaposition of these reflections encapsulated the broader debate. Where Trump emphasized cohesion and reassurance, Omar emphasized challenge and transformation. Both framed their positions as rooted in responsibility, yet their definitions of that responsibility diverged in meaningful ways. As the segment drew to a close, the moderator signaled an upcoming transition to audience questions. The shift promised to introduce new voices into the discussion, potentially reframing the issues through personal experience. The anticipation of this transition added a sense of uncertainty, as neither participant could fully predict the direction the conversation might take. The audience's reactions suggested a mixture of engagement and apprehension. Some appeared eager to participate, while others seemed content to observe, recognizing the complexity of the exchange. The event had evolved into a multifaceted dialogue, shaped as much by interpretation as by assertion. As the format transitioned toward audience participation, the structure of the event subtly shifted once again. The previously linear exchange between the two principal figures now faced the unpredictability of individual voices, each carrying personal concerns and perspectives. This shift altered not only the content of the discussion, but its rhythm, introducing moments of spontaneity that contrasted with the carefully constructed arguments presented earlier. The first audience question focused on trust in public institutions, a theme that resonated strongly with the ongoing debate. The questioners spoke deliberately, framing their concern around perceived erosion of confidence in government and the role public rhetoric played in shaping that perception. The inquiry did not explicitly favor either participant, instead inviting reflection on a shared societal challenge. Trump responded by reiterating his emphasis on clarity and consistency. He argued that trust was built incrementally through predictable behavior and transparent communication. According to his framing, when leaders appeared ambiguous or dismissive of widely held concerns, confidence weakened. His response echoed earlier themes, reinforcing the continuity of his narrative across different segments of the event. Omar approached the question from a different angle, focusing on representation and inclusion. She argued that trust could not exist where communities felt unheard or marginalized. From her perspective, skepticism toward institutions often stemmed from historical patterns of exclusion rather than isolated rhetorical missteps. Her response broadened the scope of the question, situating individual trust within a collective historical context. The contrast between these answers highlighted how the same concern could generate divergent interpretations. Trump emphasized procedural reliability, while Omar emphasized relational legitimacy. Both addressed trust, yet their responses suggested different pathways toward restoring it. The audience reaction reflected this divide, with nods and murmurs signaling varied points of resonance. Subsequent questions introduced additional layers to the discussion. One audience member asked about the role of media in amplifying conflict, noting how selective coverage could intensify polarization. This question prompted both participants to reflect on forces beyond their immediate control, shifting attention to the broader information ecosystem. Trump criticized what he described as fragmented coverage that prioritized controversy over substance. He argued that such practices distorted public understanding and incentivized extreme framing. His remarks aligned with his broader skepticism toward media institutions, framing them as influential intermediaries capable of shaping narratives in ways that affected democratic discourse. Omar acknowledged the media's influence, but emphasized the responsibility of public figures to communicate thoughtfully, regardless of coverage. She argued that leaders could not abdicate responsibility for how their words were interpreted, even in a fragmented media environment. Her response placed agency firmly with elected officials, suggesting that intentional communication could mitigate misrepresentation. As audience participation continued, the diversity of questions underscored the multiplicity of concerns shaping public engagement. Topics ranged from civic education to political polarization, each question reflecting a different dimension of the national conversation. This diversity diluted the intensity of the earlier confrontation, replacing it with a more distributed form of dialogue. Despite this shift, underlying tensions remained visible. Trump continued to anchor his responses in examples and general principles, maintaining the evidentiary tone he had established earlier. Omar continued to contextualize, drawing connections between individual issues and systemic patterns. Their respective styles remained consistent, reinforcing the sense that the event was revealing enduring approaches rather than situational tactics. The moderator's role became more facilitative during this phase, focusing on time management and equitable participation. By distributing questions evenly and limiting follow-ups, the moderator aimed to prevent any single line of inquiry from dominating. This structural intervention helped restore a measure of balance, even as substantive disagreements persisted. Audience reactions during this segment were notably more varied. Some questions elicited broad agreement, while others produced mixed responses. The variability reflected the heterogeneity of the audience itself, composed of individuals with distinct priorities and experiences. The event thus mirrored the broader democratic challenge of accommodating pluralism within a shared forum. As the segment progressed, both participants appeared to adjust their pacing. Responses became slightly more concise, suggesting an awareness of time constraints and audience attention. Despite this, neither abandoned their core themes. Instead, each adapted their delivery to the evolving format while preserving narrative coherence. One particularly reflective moment occurred when an audience member asked about the possibility of reconciliation across deep ideological divides. The question was posed without expectation of a definitive answer, instead inviting contemplation. This moment introduced a quieter tone, prompting both participants to move beyond critique toward reflection. Trump responded by emphasizing the importance of shared experiences and symbols, arguing that common reference points provided a foundation for dialogue. He suggested that while disagreements were inevitable, recognition of shared history could serve as a stabilizing force. His response returned to themes of unity and continuity, framing reconciliation as a matter of reaffirmation. Omar responded by emphasizing empathy and listening, arguing that reconciliation required acknowledgement of pain and injustice. She suggested that shared symbols alone were insufficient without substantive engagement with lived realities. Her response framed reconciliation as an active process rather than a symbolic gesture. The juxtaposition of these responses encapsulated the enduring tension between affirmation and transformation. Both participants expressed hope for dialogue, yet envisioned different mechanisms for achieving it. The audience's reaction suggested that this tension resonated deeply, reflecting unresolved questions within the broader political landscape. As the audience question segment drew toward its conclusion, the cumulative effect of diverse voices and perspectives had softened the earlier adversarial tone without eliminating disagreement. The event now felt less like a confrontation and more like a complex mosaic of viewpoints, each contributing to a multifaceted understanding of the issues at hand. As the event moved closer to its conclusion, the accumulated layers of dialogue began to reshape how each participant framed their final contributions. The earlier sharpness of contrast softened into a more reflective cadence, not because disagreements had been resolved, but because the boundaries of those disagreements had been more clearly defined. The discussion now operated within a shared understanding of its own complexity. The moderator introduced the final set of audience questions with an emphasis on forward-looking perspectives. Rather than revisiting earlier points of contention, These questions sought insight into the future, how political discourse might evolve, and what responsibilities public figures would bear in shaping that evolution. This shift subtly reoriented the discussion away from retrospective examination toward prospective responsibility. Trump approached these questions by reiterating his belief in the enduring importance of institutional stability. He argued that while political cycles bring change, the underlying framework of governance must remain recognizable and dependable. From his perspective, predictability fostered confidence, and confidence enabled effective participation. His remarks suggested that progress was best achieved through incremental adjustment rather than abrupt redefinition. Omar responded by emphasizing the inevitability of transformation in response to social change. She argued that institutions derived legitimacy not from permanence alone, but from their capacity to adapt to evolving realities. Her framing suggested that stability and change were not mutually exclusive, but that balance required continuous reassessment. This emphasis on adaptability echoed her earlier arguments about growth and context. The contrast between these responses again revealed differing assumptions about risk. Trump's perspective prioritized minimizing uncertainty, viewing it as a potential source of instability. Omar's perspective acknowledged uncertainty as an inherent feature of progress, one that could be navigated through inclusive dialogue and accountability. These differing orientations toward risk shaped their respective visions of political leadership. As the final audience questions unfolded, themes of civic engagement and public participation emerged prominently. One question addressed declining voter turnout and the perception that political processes were increasingly disconnected from everyday concerns. This inquiry invited both participants to consider how rhetoric and policy might influence civic motivation. Trump responded by emphasizing clear messaging and tangible outcomes. He argued that when citizens saw direct results from policy decisions, engagement naturally increased. His response framed civic participation as a response to efficacy, suggesting that trust grew when institutions demonstrated competence and responsiveness. Omar approached the issue by highlighting accessibility and representation. She argued that engagement declined when individuals felt excluded from decision-making processes. From her perspective, increasing participation required lowering barriers and ensuring that diverse voices were meaningfully incorporated. Her response emphasized process as much as outcome. The audience's reaction to these responses suggested broad recognition of the problem, even as solutions diverged. The shared concern underscored the degree to which civic disengagement had become a central challenge, transcending partisan boundaries. This moment of convergence provided a brief sense of common ground amid ongoing disagreement. As time constraints became more apparent, the moderator invited each participant to offer closing reflections. The framing of this invitation emphasized synthesis rather than summary, encouraging both speakers to articulate how they understood the broader significance of the discussion. The atmosphere shifted once more, becoming quieter and more attentive. Trump's closing remarks focused on responsibility and memory. He emphasized that public discourse did not occur in a vacuum, but against a backdrop of shared experiences and collective history. His message suggested that leaders bore a duty to honor that history through measured language and consistent conduct. While acknowledging disagreement as inevitable, he framed respect as non-negotiable. Omar's closing remarks emphasized honesty and courage. She argued that meaningful progress required confronting uncomfortable truths and challenging inherited assumptions. Her message framed discourse as a tool for illumination rather than reassurance, suggesting that discomfort could coexist with respect. She emphasized the importance of maintaining empathy even amid disagreement. The juxtaposition of these closing reflections encapsulated the core tension of the event. Where Trump emphasized continuity and reassurance, Omar emphasized challenge and transformation. Both framed their positions as rooted in democratic responsibility, yet their interpretations of that responsibility remained distinct. As the broadcast drew to a close, the moderator thanked both participants and the audience, acknowledging the intensity and complexity of the discussion. The final moments were marked by a restrained formality, with polite gestures replacing the earlier intensity. The event concluded not with resolution, but with a sense of open-endedness. In the aftermath, viewers were left to interpret the exchange through their own frameworks and priorities. The discussion offered no definitive answers, but instead illuminated the contours of contemporary political discourse, how narrative, context, memory, and accountability intersected in shaping public understanding. The town hall functioned less as a forum for consensus and more as a mirror reflecting the divisions and aspirations of the moment. The significance of the event extended beyond its immediate content. It demonstrated how modern political engagement often unfolds through sustained exposure rather than decisive moments. Meaning emerged not from singular statements, but from patterns revealed over time. In this sense, the discussion itself became an example of the dynamics it sought to examine. In the immediate period following the conclusion of the broadcast, interpretation began to unfold across multiple layers of public discourse. Analysts, commentators, and ordinary viewers each approached the exchange with distinct expectations and interpretive frameworks, producing a wide spectrum of reactions. The event did not settle debates so much as redistribute them, extending the conversation into new arenas shaped by personal experience and ideological alignment. Media analysis in the hours after the broadcast reflected this fragmentation. Some commentators emphasized Trump's methodical approach, noting his reliance on documented material and repetition as a means of reinforcing accountability. Others focused on Omar's emphasis on context and systemic critique, interpreting her responses as part of a broader effort to challenge established narratives. The divergence in coverage mirrored the divergence within the event itself. Social media platforms amplified these contrasts. Short clips circulated rapidly, often detached from the longer arc of the discussion. In isolation, individual moments appeared sharper and more definitive than they had within the full context of the exchange. This fragmentation altered perception, encouraging rapid judgment rather than sustained reflection. The phenomenon underscored how modern discourse often privileges immediacy over continuity. Trump's supporters highlighted what they perceived as consistency and resolve. They framed his approach as evidence of leadership grounded in clarity and respect for shared norms. In their view, his insistence on accountability resonated as a corrective to what they saw as excessive abstraction in political language. This interpretation reinforced existing beliefs about the importance of stability and tradition. Omar's supporters emphasized her focus on inclusion and critical analysis. They interpreted her responses as necessary challenges to entrenched systems and narratives. From this perspective, her emphasis on context represented intellectual rigor rather than evasion. The exchange was framed as an illustration of the difficulties faced by voices attempting to broaden the scope of political discourse. Between these poles existed a large group of viewers whose reactions were less definitive. For them, the event highlighted complexity rather than clarity. They observed moments of validity in both positions and recognized the difficulty of reconciling competing priorities within a single framework. This ambivalence reflected a broader sense of uncertainty within the political landscape. Academic observers approached the event as a case study in rhetorical strategy. They noted how Trump's reliance on documentation functioned as a grounding mechanism, anchoring abstract debates in concrete reference points. Omar's reliance on thematic explanation was analyzed as an effort to elevate the discussion beyond individual statements toward structural analysis. Both strategies were recognized as effective within their respective traditions. The event also prompted renewed discussion about the format of political engagement itself. Critics questioned whether town hall settings were conducive to nuanced exploration of complex issues, given time constraints and audience dynamics. Supporters argued that the format allowed for spontaneous interaction and exposure to diverse perspectives. The debate over format paralleled the debate over substance. In political circles, the exchange was dissected for its potential implications. Strategists considered how the themes that emerged might influence future messaging and campaign tactics. The emphasis on accountability, context, and trust was recognized as reflective of broader voter concerns. Whether these themes would translate into measurable impact remained uncertain. The role of the moderator was also scrutinized. Some observers praised the effort to maintain balance amid competing demands, while others argued that stronger intervention might have redirected the discussion toward policy. This critique highlighted the inherent tension faced by moderators in high-stakes political events, where neutrality and control often pull in opposite directions. As days passed, references to the event continued to surface in related discussions. Politicians cited moments from the exchange to support their own arguments, selectively invoking statements that aligned with their positions. This selective appropriation further fragmented the original context, reinforcing the sense that meaning was being continuously renegotiated. The event's longevity in public memory appeared tied less to specific statements than to the broader contrast it embodied. It came to symbolize a clash between different approaches to political responsibility, one emphasizing continuity and reassurance, the other emphasizing critique and transformation. This symbolic function extended the relevance of the exchange beyond its immediate content. For some viewers, the event prompted personal reflection on their own expectations of leadership. Questions about consistency, growth, and accountability resonated at an individual level, influencing how they evaluated public figures more broadly. In this sense, the discussion functioned as a catalyst for introspection rather than persuasion. The exchange also highlighted generational differences in political engagement. Younger viewers tended to respond more strongly to arguments emphasizing systemic critique and adaptability, while older viewers often gravitated toward themes of stability and shared history. These tendencies were not absolute, but they suggested patterns that analysts continued to explore. As the conversation diffused into broader discourse, its original intensity gradually diminished. Yet, the underlying questions it raised persisted, resurfacing in subsequent debates and discussions. The event became a reference point, cited not for its conclusions, but for the tensions it illuminated. In retrospect, the significance of the exchange lay in its refusal to resolve. By exposing contrasting assumptions without reconciling them, it invited ongoing engagement rather than closure. This open-endedness aligned with the realities of contemporary political life, where definitive answers are rare and dialogue remains perpetually unfinished. As time passed and the immediate reactions began to settle, a more reflective phase of interpretation emerged. This stage was marked not by the urgency of response, but by attempts to situate the event within longer historical and political trajectories. Commentators who initially reacted emotionally now revisited the exchange with greater distance, examining not just what was said, but why it resonated as it did. One recurring theme in these reflections was the notion of narrative ownership. Observers noted that both participants had entered the event with pre-existing narratives, yet the interaction forced each to adapt. Trump's emphasis on record and repetition was interpreted as an effort to anchor the conversation in fixed reference points, limiting interpretive flexibility. Omar's emphasis on context and systemic framing, by contrast, was seen as an attempt to expand interpretive space, allowing meaning to remain dynamic. This tension between fixation and fluidity became a focal point of analysis. Some analysts argued that political stability depended on fixed narratives that provided citizens with a sense of continuity. Others countered that such fixation risked obscuring injustice and suppressing necessary critique. The event thus became a symbolic battleground for competing philosophies of meaning-making. The educational implications of the exchange also attracted attention. Educators and civic organizations referenced the discussion when addressing questions about media literacy and critical thinking. The fragmented circulation of clips was used as an example of how selective exposure could distort understanding. In this context, the event served as a teaching tool, illustrating the importance of engaging with complete arguments rather than isolated moments. From a psychological perspective, commentators examined how sustained confrontation influenced perception. The gradual accumulation of points, rather than dramatic confrontation, shaped viewer interpretation over time. This slow-building intensity contrasted with the rapid consumption patterns typical of digital media, challenging audiences to remain attentive and reflective. The role of emotion in the exchange continued to be debated. While neither participant displayed overt emotional volatility, subtle cues, pauses, emphasis, restraint were analyzed for their impact. Some viewers interpreted Trump's measured tone as control and confidence, while others perceived it as calculated detachment. Similarly, Omar's composure was read by some as resilience and by others as guarded defensiveness. These interpretations revealed how emotional perception often reflected the viewer's own expectations. As the event receded further into memory, it increasingly functioned as a reference rather than a focal point. Subsequent political discussions invoked it indirectly, using its themes to frame new debates. In this way, the exchange became embedded within a larger discursive network, influencing conversations without dominating them. The endurance of the event's relevance suggested that its significance lay not in novelty, but in articulation. It articulated tensions that already existed, giving them visible form. This articulation allowed individuals to recognize patterns in other contexts, reinforcing the event's interpretive value. At the same time, critics warned against overstating its importance. They argued that no single exchange could encapsulate the full complexity of political life. This caution underscored the risk of symbolic inflation, where events are burdened with meanings beyond their scope. Yet, even these critiques acknowledged that the discussion had captured something essential about contemporary discourse. The balance between symbolism and substance thus remained unresolved. The event was neither purely performative nor purely substantive. It occupied an ambiguous space between the two. This ambiguity, rather than diminishing its impact, may have enhanced it, allowing different audiences to project their concerns onto the exchange. In retrospect, the event illustrated how political meaning is co-produced by participants and observers alike. Statements gained significance through repetition, interpretation, and circulation. No single actor controlled the narrative entirely, despite attempts to do so. This diffusion of meaning reflected broader shifts in how authority and interpretation function in the modern public sphere. As attention gradually moved on, the event's legacy persisted in subtle ways. It influenced how future exchanges were framed, how moderators approached balance, and how audiences evaluated discourse. Its impact was incremental rather than dramatic, reinforcing the idea that political culture evolves through accumulation rather than rupture.